Hey everyone, it's Kuk here. I hope you've had a nice transition into the new year. On that occasion, I'm going to make a video which I think will become an annual tradition, a list of my 10 favorite books I read last year. The list is in no particular order, and I will give you some info on each book so you could decide if it's something you'd like to read yourself. In the description you will find links to each book I mention, for free where available. So, without further ado, here are the 10 best books I've read in 2018. The Accursed Share, Volume 1, by George Bataille. My subscribers should know about Bataille now, as my Halloween video, Hellraiser, Bataille, and Limit Experiences, was about him. Although Bataille is quite well known in continental philosophy circles, he's rarely mentioned in the mainstream. His influence on French philosophy is huge. He was read and appreciated by Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, and Baudrillard, all the big names of postmodernism. Lacan was a friend of his and was influenced by him as well. Sartre read him, and the German philosopher Heidegger did too. Although he didn't adhere to any specific theoretical movement, he could be seen as kind of a proto-post-structuralist, due to his anticipations of many post-structuralist notions. And he could also be seen as the bridge, or at least one of the bridges that connects Nietzsche and post-structuralism. Although many people know Bataille because of his surreal and obscene works of fiction, the short story of the Eye being the most popular, he also wrote works of philosophy. Many of them are very fragmented. Books like On Nietzsche and Guilty are collections of short passages, aphorisms, intercut with bits of poetry and autobiography. Personally, I'm not a big fan of that style of writing philosophy, and The Accursed Share, being Bataille's most systematic work, is why it's also my favorite. This book was by Bataille himself described as a work of political economy, which certainly surprised his followers at the time that this book was being released. But it's certainly not a traditional work of political science. It's a strange mix of philosophy, ethics, anthropology, and history. Bataille's main thesis is that any organism, whether biological or social or ecological or economic, as it accumulates energy, it tries to use it to grow and expand itself. In other words, utilize that energy productively. However, if the energy continues accumulating, there inevitably comes a point where surplus energy can no longer be channeled into productivity, but must be wasted without purpose. This surplus share of energy that must be wasted without purpose is what Bataille calls the accursed share. It's a very simple idea, but Bataille makes a lot out of it. He sees it as a way of explaining certain psychological behaviors, and here the connection to psychoanalysis might be obvious, as a way of explaining certain historical events or economic phenomena. And he also sees it as the origin of the sacred or the sovereign. The sacred is that which has no utility. It is not subservient to some productive end, but consists entirely of consumption without purpose. The book begins with a theoretical characterization of the accursed share, as well as what Bataille calls general economy, and the rest of the book applies the developed framework to various historical examples, ranging from Aztec human sacrifice to early Muslim conquests to Soviet industrialization. It's a fascinating book, and in my experience, Bataille's most accessible and enjoyable to read. Despite its label as a work of political economy, it will be definitely of more interest to philosophers than political scientists. And although many people would reduce its value to the way it influenced subsequent continental philosophers, I think it gives you a nice and interesting framework through which to look at a variety of different phenomena. This volume is the first in a trilogy. If you're interested to go further after reading it, the second and third volumes are contained in a single book and are concerned with eroticism and sovereignty, respectively. I finished reading the third volume this month, but the first one is undeniably my favorite, and in my opinion the most theoretically significant one. In the description I've linked a PDF containing the first 3 chapters of the book, which you can read through before deciding if you'd like to buy a physical copy. The Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. You probably haven't heard of Nietzsche before. He's a pretty obscure philosopher. I'm just kidding. Just as the previous book was Bataille's most systematic work, so this book is Nietzsche's most systematic work, and again for that reason my favorite work I've read from him. This book presents the famous distinction between slave morality and master morality that's so prevalent in Nietzsche's work, a distinction I've mentioned in my video on postmodernism and identity politics. I won't recount it here as there are already so many videos explaining it, which I'll link in the description. One of the reasons for why this book was so influential and controversial is that it took moral principles that were previously seen as eternal, transcendent, and universally valid laws and explained them as an outcome of a historically contingent development. And not only that, but as stemming not from kindness or goodwill, but resentment and revenge. Many leftists are somewhat afraid of Nietzsche due to his associations with fascism, and it's obvious that he was no leftist. He despised the democratic, socialist, and communist movements of his time, and was pretty misogynistic as well. I have no reason to downplay that. Although it should be noted also that he would have found German fascism just as distasteful, due to his hatred for both nationalism and anti-Semitism. That being said, leftists have a lot to gain from Nietzsche's work. His criticism of traditional morality, of notions of guilt and sin, his call to affirm life and transform values, could all be taken up by leftists. In fact, I would argue leftists are the only ones who could be Nietzscheans today, as at the very least the mainstream right sinks deeper and deeper into life denial and resentment. There's a refreshing kind of honesty that runs throughout Nietzsche's works. He does not justify himself through reference to some transcendent order or eternal principles. And neither should the left. There is even an interesting criticism of rights-based politics that can be found in this book, which echoes many far-left critiques. Basically, this book changed the face of continental philosophy forever, and if you have an interest in continental philosophy, you have to read it. Philosophy and Real Politics by Raymond Goose. Raymond Goose is great and is full of insights. He has a lecture series on Nietzsche and Marx, which you should check out if you haven't before. This book is his most influential one. In it, he criticizes certain dominant trends in political theory, mainly the one that sees political theory as applied ethics. Many political theorists throughout history begin with some ideal ethical theory of justice or rights, and then try to impose it onto the world, trying to figure out how such an ethics would be applied to politics. The problem with this approach is that it makes the actual current state of the world a secondary concern. There is no shortage of such approaches, going all the way back to the origin of all political theory, Plato's Republic. But a good example for an internet video is ANCAPs. First, they develop some ideal theory of individual rights or property rights, and only then ask, how do we make this happen? ANCAPs rarely have any kind of historical or material analysis, and this makes a lot of their goals seemingly impossible. When their ethical framework meets reality, they often end up supporting authoritarian state leaders. In contrast to this, Raymond Goose proposes a realist framework for political theory, consisting of 4 elements or principles. 1. Realism. Start not from an ideal ethical theory, from a theory of how people ought to act, but how they do actually currently act in reality. What motivates them? How do economic, political, social institutions actually operate? 2. Focus on actions. We should focus on actions rather than beliefs, theories, or propositions. Beliefs, theories, or propositions are important insofar as they are used as actions or lead to action. 3. Politics are historically located. There are no interesting political questions that are not historically specific. And 4. Politics is more like a skill or a craft than a rigid theory. The Marxists in the audience will probably notice how compatible such a framework is with Marxism, although people from any political persuasion could make use of such a framework. Goose then fleshes out this framework by drawing from a number of different theorists, from Weber to Nietzsche to Lenin. It's a short book, pretty influential, very lucidly written, and pretty useful. If you're interested in political theory, I'd say it's a must-read. A New Philosophy of Society by Manuel Delanda. This is a work of social ontology, in other words, theory about what kind of social entities exist. In it, Delanda proposes an alternative to what he sees as reductive trends in social theories, of which there are mainly 2 types. The first type is methodological individualism, that reduces society to simply an aggregate of individuals. Another type is a macro approach that sees society as reducible to large social structures or institutions, in light of which all smaller social entities are to be understood. Delanda's approach proposes an alternative that takes into account the transformative potential and significance of both micro and macro entities, drawing on Deleuze's theory of assemblages. He shows how large-scale social structures cannot simply be reduced to an aggregate of individuals because assemblages have emergent properties not reducible to the sum of their parts. At the same time, he does not reduce individuals to simply components of a social structure because he sees them as ontologically self-subsistent and in principle removable from the larger structures they occupy. He shows the way that different levels of social organization have both upwards and downward causality and interact in complex ways. The way he does this is interesting too. After outlining his framework, he starts at the lowest level of social organization, the individual and even sub-individual components. And in each chapter, he goes up a higher level, finally ending with cities and nations. In this way, he emphasizes the social complexity that our world consists of. In addition to this, he goes against the stereotype that postmodern theorists reduce everything to language and can only be used as such. He explicitly argues against the linguistic turn and identifies his framework as a realist and materialist one. It's a good book for those interested in social theory in general, but also those specifically interested in how Deleuze's philosophy could be applied to social theory, and Delanda's language is pretty accessible. For anyone interested in Deleuze, I also recommend Delanda's lectures, which he's great at delivering. I'll link them in the description. Are Prisons Obsolete? By Angela Davis. Angela Davis needs no introduction, I hope. She's basically a legendary activist at this point. And in this book, as the title suggests, she addresses the question of prison abolition. The best part of this book is the way Davis contextualizes and gives a history of the prison system in the US. While a lot of people see the current prison situation as natural or necessary, Davis points out how in the second half of the 20th century, there was a huge increase in the prison population and number of prisons being built, even though crime was decreasing. And surprise, surprise, how this was very profitable for the prison industry, yet did not decrease crime at all. She also examines the experiences of different prisoners, as well as the way the prison system is influenced by questions of class, race, and gender. Some people might be disappointed that the book is mostly confined to US history, and Davis does not examine the differences prisons have across countries. The biggest shortcoming of the book, however, in my opinion, is the lack of time given to proposed alternatives to prisons. At a time when prisons seem like a natural fact of life to so many people, any book about prison abolition must give attention to exploring what a society without prisons would look like. Only the end of the very last chapter is dedicated to this question, and so it really needs to be complemented by some practical and more detailed suggestions. Other than that, it's an essential read for those interested in prison abolition. Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. This is basically a classic of the contemporary left. Using a variety of theorists from Marx to Lacan to Fredric Jameson, Mark Fisher examines our current historical condition, which is characterized by the inability to conceive of any alternatives to capitalism. As the quote attributed either to Fredric Jameson or Zizek goes, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism." And this is what the phrase capitalist realism refers to. Drawing a lot on Fredric Jameson's analysis of postmodernism, Mark Fisher talks about our incapacity to make sense of our historical condition, our inability to conceive narratives, the inability to seek anything but short-term pleasure, and the way that even attempts at resistance are co-opted and incorporated into the system itself. In talking about all of this, Mark Fisher makes use of a lot of pop culture examples, which is always nice. It's a must-read for any leftist today seeking to understand the political and cultural condition that we're currently in. How to Read Lacan by Zizek. I actually haven't read anything by Zizek until this, and Zizek is kind of a meme at this point, but after reading this, I can really understand why he got so popular. Whatever you think of him, it's just a fun read. Lacan is notoriously difficult to read, probably even harder to read than Deleuze, and that's saying a lot. But Zizek presents him very accessibly, and with lots of useful examples. If you're looking for an introduction to Lacan in general, this is a pretty good entry point. Nietzsche and Philosophy by Deleuze. Hey, so we had a book by Nietzsche, and we had a book influenced by Deleuze, and now we have a book by Deleuze about Nietzsche. Deleuze is generally considered to be a postmodern philosopher, as you should know since the past few weeks everyone's been making videos on him, and he's notoriously difficult to read, but some of his most accessible works are actually secondary literature on various modern philosophers, like Hume, Spinoza, and in this case Nietzsche. When Deleuze wrote secondary literature on major philosophers, for him it wasn't just an academic exercise of summarizing philosophical history. For him it was a way of developing new interpretations of major philosophers, exposing things in them that have sometimes been overlooked or treated differently or neglected, and showing how interpretations of major philosophers could have developed very differently. This book could also be said to be a kind of symptomatic reading, a reading that tries to bring out things in the text that the author himself wasn't able to say, typically because of some ideological convictions. And sometimes the way Deleuze reads Nietzsche seems like a bit of a stretch. The reading is heavily ontological, and many things that Nietzsche says in quite specific or narrow terms, Deleuze expands to general ontological principles. But it's interesting to see how different someone's interpretation of Nietzsche can be from dominant ones, while still being coherent and built entirely on Nietzsche's texts. And because it's more accessible than many of Deleuze's original works, it can be a good starting point to understanding Deleuze himself and his kind of thinking. Gilles Deleuze by Todd May. Here we have another book related to Deleuze. I think I already recommended this in my postmodernism FAQ. There's not much to say about it. It's an introductory book to the philosophy of Deleuze, but what's special about it is how clearly and accessibly it is written. One of the most common things that annoys people about postmodernist theory is how difficult the writing styles often are, but Todd May is an exception. Ghosts of My Life, Writings on Depression, Ontology, and Lost Futures by Mark Fisher, once again. This is Mark Fisher, as always, taking on culture through critical theory, but in a very personal way this time. He talks about ontology and lost futures, something I've of course covered before, using examples that were important to his own personal life, drawing from various movies, musical projects, and TV shows. And throughout the book, he examines everything from jungle music to contemporary radio pop to absolutely beautiful observations about Joy Division. There are also some great theoretical insights into movies. I especially enjoy the chapter on Inception. The only potential problem in this book is that if you're not familiar with the cultural examples Mark Fisher talks about, you might find them somewhat uninteresting or difficult to follow. He refers to some UK TV shows that I've never seen, as well as some albums I've never heard. However, you could turn this read into a special experience by making yourself familiar with each cultural example Fisher mentions as you read along. The cultural phenomena that Mark Fisher addresses here are still just as ever prevalent today. So that was it. I hope you found some of the book descriptions interesting and perhaps discovered something here to add to your reading list. Lastly, I'd like to reply to two of my patrons. Lucas Marcelli asks what my favorite sci-fi book is. I pretty much never read fiction, so I don't have much to choose from here. In fact, the only sci-fi book I ever remember reading is Flatland, A Romance of Many Dimensions, which I read when I was around 13 years old. It's an interesting book from what I remember because it's a satirical commentary on Victorian society and at the same time an examination of dimensions. The characters are geometrical figures whose social status is determined by their shapes, and the main character is a two-dimensional shape living in a two-dimensional world, who eventually comes to experience a three-dimensional world and even a one-dimensional world. Jesus Crust wants me to read The Naked Socialist for laughs. Does anyone know how worthwhile or funny that would be? I could subject myself to that kind of torture if enough people think I should. So, that's it. Happy New Year, everyone, especially my patrons. Thank you to Neo-Reactionary,
But
M. Jim, E.V. Rosk, E-Wix, Sergio Gomez Del Real, Julian 2, Clark Fletcher, Spaghettisburg, Eric Goldman, Mark Kalpax, Toddnet, A Pronounceable Name, Tendies123, Son, Daniel Grimmer, Quantum Computation, Eric Coronado, Trevor Stevenson, Kelly Rankin, and everyone else. I greatly appreciate you. Sorry that this video took a while to come out. I've been really busy. I promise that my next video will be a more typical kind of Cook philosophy video, perhaps a philosophical movie analysis or something along those lines. I'll put up a poll on my Patreon so you could vote on the next topic soon. Until then, I hope you have a nice day, a nice night, and a nice week. Thank you.